I shifted in the passenger seat, hospital bracelet still tight around my wrist, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my coat. "We're here," my son said, without looking at me. But this wasn't home. This was a row of steel doors and concrete silence, a storage unit. He got out, opened one, and started unloading my things. No explanation, no apology. Just a quiet betrayal wrapped in the hum of fluorescent lights. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Doris sat quietly in the passenger seat, the faint hum of the car's engine filling the space between her and Ethan. The ride felt strange, too quiet, too smooth. She hadn't said much since leaving the hospital, her body still recovering from surgery, but she could feel his eyes glancing at her every so often, the fake cheerfulness in his smile too noticeable to ignore. "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked, his voice higher than usual, as though he were trying to sound upbeat, but it came out strained. Doris nodded weakly, her mind foggy from the painkillers. She hadn't asked him to take her home after the surgery. Home had become a place that no longer felt like hers. But she hadn't expected this either. Ethan's insistence that they go out for a celebration lunch was unusual enough, but there was something off about his demeanor. She shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the gnawing sensation in her chest, but it wouldn't leave her alone. The streets blurred by in a flash of gray, the world outside too mundane for the storm that was building inside her. She watched the familiar storefronts pass by, feeling oddly disconnected from it all. But then, instead of turning toward their neighborhood, Ethan took a sharp right turn into a storage facility parking lot. Doris frowned, her gaze fixing on the sign as the car slowed to a stop. It didn't make sense. Why here? Why now? Ethan killed the engine, the click of the ignition making Doris' stomach tighten. Ethan? What are we doing here?" she asked, the confusion in her voice clear. "Just a quick stop," he said, his smile widening just a bit too much. He pushed open the door and stepped out, not giving her a chance to ask more questions. Doris didn't move immediately. She wasn't sure if she should wait for an explanation, but her limbs felt heavy. A strange feeling gnawed at her, the kind you can't quite place, but know isn't right. She looked out at the stark, metal units lined up in neat rows, their silver doors gleaming under the afternoon sun. It was an empty, sterile place, nothing like the warmth of home she had imagined after the surgery. She had hoped for comfort, for the quiet space to recover and be cared for. Ethan was already at the back of the car, pulling out her suitcase. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the garage, staring at Laura like she was seeing a burglar in pearls. Laura froze mid-step, one hand still on the keypad beside the locked cabinets, where Evelyn kept the deed archives and donation receipts, none of which had ever been shared with Mark or her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Not alone. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Looking for something?" Laura straightened slowly, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear as if they'd run into each other at brunch. "I was just checking if any of the donation records were misplaced." Mark thought. "I'm sure he did." Evelyn's voice was razor-sharp. "You can leave now." Laura's eyes flickered to the locked drawers, then back to Evelyn. "You know, most people your age don't think clearly when they're under pressure. That kind of paranoia, it's dangerous. For you, for your legacy." Evelyn didn't blink. "If you knew anything about legacy, Laura, you wouldn't be standing in my garage like a thief in a cardigan." Laura's face flushed. "This is vindictive." Evelyn stepped forward, closing the space between them with the quiet command of a queen reclaiming her throne. "No, it's meticulous. And that's why you're scared." She didn't wait for Laura's response, just turned her back, cane tapping against the floor with every deliberate step, and walked out. By noon the next day, Howard had returned to the house, the fresh legal draft open on the dining table like a surgical tool. "This addendum," he said, adjusting his glasses, "formally reallocates what used to be discretionary funds, liquid assets, property value overflow, and unused endowments. We're tying every dollar to something real, public, traceable." Evelyn nodded. "Scholarships, library programs, new teacher residencies. I want every cent marked by intention." "And not a cent," Howard added, "that can be clawed back by Mark or Laura. It's airtight. Public filings, county confirmation, foundation transparency. Donna leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. He's bleeding reputation faster than money now. That courtroom footage made the rounds online. Everyone saw the heirlooms. Howard clicked his pen. They'll see this too. I'm submitting a public notice to the probate clerk's office once this is signed. Evelyn took the pen and lowered herself into her seat, slow but unshaken. The moment was heavy, not with hesitation but with precision. She scanned the language again, her eyes pausing on the words irrevocable donation clause. Every word was a knife Mark would never see coming. She signed her name, once, twice, a third time on the last page, beside the notary line. Howard sealed the documents into a protective sleeve, like one might seal away evidence at a crime scene. That's it, he said. They're officially excluded, permanently, legally, publicly. Evelyn reached for her tea but didn't sip it. Let them accuse me of cruelty. They built this prison with their own hands. I just locked the door behind them. The notice went live on the county clerk's site by 3:47 p.m. By 4:12, the local press picked it up. By 5 Mao, it was being shared in the neighborhood's Facebook group. Grant estate redirection, no family beneficiaries named. The post beneath the article was simple, written by a neighbor Evelyn hadn't spoken to in months. Guess she really meant it. That evening, Evelyn stepped out onto her porch just as the last light of day began to fade. The air was crisp, fall creeping closer. Donna joined her, holding 2 glasses of wine. Do you feel lighter? Donna asked, handing one over. No, Evelyn replied, gazing out across her quiet lawn. But I feel sharper. From the sidewalk, 2 teenagers walked by, nodding politely as they passed. Evelyn nodded back. They'd been recipients of her husband's early science grant 10 years ago. Now they were college-bound. That was legacy. But the moment shattered when a car screeched to a halt in front of the house. Laura climbed out, again alone. No pearls, no calm, just rage. She stomped to the edge of the lawn, holding a manila envelope in one hand. You want a war? She shouted. You just got one. Evelyn didn't rise from her chair. She simply set her wine down and folded her hands in her lap. Then I hope you brought more than paper, she said, coolly. Laura threw the envelope onto the grass and stormed off, heels snapping. Donna picked up the envelope, her brow furrowed as she opened it. Inside, photographs, color, dated, time-stamped. A nod of Evelyn, of Howard, at a restaurant, with someone Evelyn hadn't seen in years. The voice on the voicemail was low, breathy, and unmistakably furious. You're going to regret this, Evelyn. All of it. You think this ends with your little papers and your smug little smile. You'll choke on your legacy. The line went dead. Evelyn stood in her study, phone in hand, the silence that followed somehow louder than the words themselves. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in sharp stripes across her desk. Donna stood behind her, stone-faced, arms crossed. Neither of them had spoken for a full minute. Evelyn turned slowly and set the phone on the desk between them. That wasn't Mark, she said. Donna's eyebrows lifted slightly. No, that voice had lipstick on it. Howard arrived within the hour, already buttoning his coat before he even stepped into the foyer. His tone was brisk, but beneath it was a sharp edge of fury. You saved the recording? He asked as he set his briefcase down. Of course, Evelyn said. And I've already emailed it to 3 different drives. Just in case something happens to my phone between here and court. Howard offered a tight smile. You've officially become my favorite client. By 3 p.m., they were standing in front of Judge Simmons once again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Word had spread that this wasn't just about a will or a family spat anymore. This was starting to smell like something darker. Laura sat alone at the defense table. Her perfectly coiffed hair was pulled tighter than usual, her expression brittle, as if one more hard word might shatter her entirely. Mark was absent, his seat glaringly empty. Evelyn sat calm, composed, her cane resting against her chair like an extension of her spine. Howard stood. Your Honor, we'd like to enter a new piece of evidence into the record. A voicemail left on Ms. Grant's personal phone at 2:03 a.m. this morning. The voice belongs to Laura Grant. and the content qualifies as both a veiled threat and an attempt at intimidation. Judge Simmons held up a hand. "Play it," Howard did. The courtroom fell silent as Laura's voice filled the space. Low, venomous, unmistakably hers. When it ended, Simmons leaned back in her chair slowly. Her silence was deliberate, heavy. She let it settle like dust after an explosion. Then, "Mrs. Grant, you've crossed the line." Laura opened her mouth to speak, but the judge didn't give her the chance. "This court will not be used as a stage for petty vengeance, and I will not tolerate psychological games meant to coerce or intimidate an opposing party. If there is one more instance of harassment, verbal, physical, digital, I will hold you in contempt and remand you on the spot." Laura's face flushed a violent red. She stood abruptly. "This entire hearing is a circus. She's manipulated the will, the town, the press." Judge Simmons banged her gavel. "That's enough." Howard folded his hands. Evelyn didn't move. Laura looked around, perhaps expecting someone to come to her defense. No one did. Slowly, stiffly, she gathered her things, shoved them into her designer bag, and stormed out of the courtroom without looking back. The door clicked shut behind her like the closing of a vault. Outside the courthouse, Donna exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all week. "The cracks are showing," she murmured. "They've been there a while," Evelyn said, adjusting her coat. She just finally heard one splinter. That evening, Evelyn stood in the attic of her home, the late sun washing the old floorboards in soft gold. Dust danced in the light like ash. She was surrounded by boxes, books, handwritten lesson plans, old student thank-you cards, shelves of worn classics, her husband's library, his pride and joy. He'd taught English literature for 36 years, built this collection one rare edition at a time. She ran her fingers across the spines. "He would have hated seeing them in this mess," she said quietly. Donna, carrying a clipboard and camera to catalog the collection for donation, smiled gently. "He'd be proud you didn't let it rot with the wrong people." Evelyn nodded, turning to a large banker's box labeled "for transfer." "These go to the Jefferson Public School District. They're building a new library wing." She placed the final book, a first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, on top of the pile. "They'll make better use of it than Mark ever would have." Later that night, Evelyn stepped out onto her back porch, wrapped in her shawl, the air crisp with coming fall. Crickets whispered in the hedges. The moon hung low, pale and watchful. Donna joined her, handing her a manila folder. "It's official," she said. Laura filed notice. "She's withdrawn from the hearings, entirely." Evelyn took the folder, flipped it open, then she paused, because tucked behind the court paperwork was a note, typed, short. "He's going to lose everything, and he's going to blame you for it. I won't be there to stop him next time." Evelyn lowered the paper slowly, her jaw tightening, because Laura was out, and that meant Mark was going to get desperate. The courthouse was full before the hours struck 9. Every pew creaked under the weight of curious neighbors, whispered alliances, and people who had once politely smiled at Evelyn in grocery store aisles, but now leaned forward, hungry for the fall or the victory. Phones were tucked into coat pockets, texts already flying through group chats. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore, it was spectacle. Evelyn entered slowly, escorted by Howard and Donna, her cane tapping steadily against the marble floor. She wore navy wool, sharp lines, understated pearls, not a widow's uniform, but a commander's. Howard carried a thick folder, the culmination of weeks of work, labeled in tidy black print: grant fee, grant, fraud, misrepresentation, intimidation, theft. On the defense bench, Mark sat alone. No Laura, no lawyer, just him, his tie askew, a faint sheen of sweat above his brow. He shifted restlessly, his jaw grinding like a man chewing glass. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Simmons entered with her usual grace, wrapped in iron. "This hearing," she began, "is to determine the validity of claims made by Mark Grant on the Grant estate, following multiple filings from both parties, and to assess supporting evidence of misconduct." Her gaze drifted to Mark, and stayed there a second longer than necessary. "Mr. Blake," she nodded toward Howard. "Proceed." Howard stood. The court has received, via affidavit, subpoena, and direct witness testimony, proof that Mr. Grant knowingly attempted to defraud his mother, Evelyn Grant, through forged documentation, asset misrepresentation, and unlawful liquidation of personal property. Additionally, Howard paused, flipping a page. We present a record of intimidation and threats delivered through associates of Mr. Grant, now corroborated through voicemail and court-certified analysis. Murmurs rolled through the gallery like a gust of wind. Exhibit A, he said, holding up the watch. Exhibit B, affidavit from the pawn shop, with Mr. Grant's signature. Exhibit C, voicemail transcript. Exhibit D, record of attempted loans secured against estate assets still under legal ownership by Ms. Grant. He stepped back. Your Honor, the question isn't whether misconduct occurred. It's how far Mr. Grant was willing to go before the court said, enough. Judge Simmons nodded once. Call your witness. Evelyn rose, and for a brief moment, as she crossed the courtroom floor, everything else fell silent. She took the stand without hesitation. State your name for the record. Evelyn Margaret Grant, and your relationship to Mr. Grant. And in that moment, as the full gravity of her abandonment settled over her, Doris realized there was no escaping the cold concrete of her new reality. Doris sat alone in the dim light of the storage unit, her hands trembling as they hovered over a small stack of papers. The boxes, now empty except for a few odds and ends, stood around her like silent witnesses to her betrayal. The weight of the evidence was slowly sinking in, but every time she tried to grasp it fully, her mind recoiled. The names, the dates, the signatures. It all seemed impossible. Then the door creaked open. Doris's heart skipped as Raphael stepped inside. His face drawn with concern. He was a lawyer, not a friend or family member, but he had agreed to meet her. His shoes echoed on the concrete floor, the sharp noise breaking the stillness. Mrs. Benson, I know this isn't easy, Raphael said, his voice quiet, sympathetic but direct. He set down a briefcase and slid it open. I've been looking over everything you sent me. Doris nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The reality of what had happened was still too fresh, too painful, but the lawyer's steady presence gave her a momentary sense of stability. I'm glad you came, Doris said, her voice hoarse. She couldn't seem to catch her breath, the air too thick in her lungs. I don't know what to do. It feels like I'm fighting ghosts. Raphael gave a small nod of understanding. We'll start with the facts. Show me what you have. Doris reached for a folder beside her and slid it across the table. Raphael opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the papers as Doris watched, barely breathing. She had gathered everything she could. Bank statements, rental agreements, and the proof of her signature on the lease of the storage unit. The more she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Ethan had acted deliberately, methodically. This, Raphael murmured, picking up the lease agreement for the storage unit. This is forged. Doris felt the ground beneath her shift. She stared at the paper in his hands, her pulse quickening. You're sure? He nodded, his brow furrowed as he pointed to the line where her signature should have been. This isn't your handwriting, Mrs. Benson. I know a forgery when I see one. Doris's stomach twisted. The weight of that revelation felt unbearable. Ethan had crossed the line, used her, manipulated her trust, and now had even stolen her name. Everything's been set up from the start, Raphael said, shifting the papers aside. We'll need to get this to a judge. You've got grounds for fraud here. But as Doris tried to process his words, a small ping interrupted her thoughts. Her phone buzzed on the table, its screen lighting up with a notification. Bank alert. Unusual activity detected. Doris froze. Her fingers reached for the phone, hands clammy as she swiped the screen. The text was clear. Ethan accessed your account today. Transfer of $3,500 from checking to savings. Location, 2:42 p.m. Access via mobile. Doris's breath caught in her chest, the room spinning around her. He hadn't just rented the storage unit behind her back. He had been siphoning money from her account while she lay unconscious in a hospital bed. While she fought to survive, he had been making sure that the resources she once trusted were drained. Raphael looked over at the phone in her hands, his gaze hardening as he saw the alert. This is bad, Doris. He's been working behind your back for weeks, possibly longer. He's been planning this. This is theft. Her fingers shook, but Doris steadied her hand. The pieces of her life, scattered and broken, were starting to fall into place. She wasn't helpless. She could fight this. I need more, Doris said, her voice steady, resolute now. She wasn't going to let this go without a fight. I need more proof. If I can show him for what he is. Raphael nodded, reaching for his laptop. We'll get what we need. I'll subpoena his bank records, his emails. We'll find everything we can to build a case. He glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment. But you need to keep quiet about this. No one else can know. Not yet. We don't want to tip him off. Doris closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She couldn't let this happen to her. Not again. Her life wasn't something to be discarded by the people she loved. Marjorie's voice echoed in her mind. This isn't right. But now, Doris had to make it right. Just as she began to gather the papers again, the door to the storage unit creaked open once more. This time it was Alan, the facility manager. His presence startled Doris, but he looked almost relieved to see her. He held up a folder in his hand, his face unreadable. I've got something for you, Alan said quietly, approaching her slowly. Doris raised an eyebrow. What is it? He set the folder down on the table and slid it across to her. The rental logs. It's all in there. Raphael flipped open the folder, his fingers moving quickly as he scanned the pages. Doris watched as he read through the documents, his expression becoming darker with each line. Then he stopped. Ethan, Raphael said softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. He's been renting units in your name for months, not just this one. Doris felt the world tilt under her feet. It wasn't just one betrayal. Ethan had been preparing for this for a long time. The lies had been building, and she had never seen it coming. Let's make sure he pays for this, Doris whispered to herself, a cold fire lighting in her chest. He won't get away with it. The drive to Doris's old house felt endless. Marjorie had insisted on coming along, though Doris hadn't asked her. It wasn't the first time she'd driven this route, but it might as well have been. The landscape outside was a blur, her thoughts too consumed by the betrayal to register anything beyond the stark reality of what was about to unfold. The house, the one where she had raised her children, where Peter had passed, where her laughter had once filled the rooms, sat in front of her like a stranger. It looked different now. The front yard, once manicured, now neglected, held a sign that stabbed at Doris's chest. For sale. Doris swallowed hard. This is it, she whispered. Marjorie didn't say anything, but Doris could feel the sympathy radiating from her. It didn't help. Doris didn't need sympathy. She needed something else, something more than words. As they pulled into the driveway, Doris's eyes scanned the house she had once called home. The familiar oak tree in the front yard had lost its luster, its branches bare and cold in the early spring air. The shutters were askew. The windows, once gleaming with warmth, were now lifeless and dim. They got out of the car, the gravel underfoot crunching with every step. Doris paused at the gate, her hand brushing against the rusted metal. Marjorie didn't wait for her to speak. You want to go inside? She asked quietly. Doris nodded, her throat thick with emotion. She knew this moment was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. Together they approached the front door. Doris fumbled for her keys, but the door creaked open on its own. It wasn't locked. She didn't know if that was worse than it being shut out of her reach. Inside, the air was stale. The smell of dust and abandonment mixed with the faint scent of wood that still lingered in the floors. The house felt hollow, like a shell that had been emptied. The living room, once filled with photographs, keepsakes, and the things that had made it home, was now stripped bare. The curtains that had hung by the windows for years had been torn down, leaving the room cold and exposed. Her heart dropped. It looks like it was never ours at all. Marjorie stepped forward, her voice low. Doris, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Doris cut her off. It doesn't matter now. Nothing matters anymore. She took a shaky breath and walked deeper into the house. Every step felt like a betrayal, like she was walking on the memories she'd built, crushing them underfoot. The kitchen, where she had cooked countless meals, was now empty. The counters bare. The sound of her own footsteps seemed to echo off the walls, deafening in its silence. But it was the bedroom that stopped her. She stood in the doorway, her breath hitching as she looked inside. The bed was gone. The dresser, the mirror, everything she had once known had been taken. She stepped inside, moving slowly toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, but it wasn't the same woman who had once lived here. That woman had been full of warmth, of love. Now all she saw was a stranger. Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't just from sadness. They were from something else. Anger. Anger at what had been done to her, what had been stolen. The life she'd spent building, the trust she'd given, ripped away in an instant. It wasn't enough, was it? Doris whispered to no one. Taking everything wasn't enough. Marjorie's voice was softer now. He doesn't deserve to have this. None of this is his. Doris clenched her fists. He's taking everything, Marjorie. He's taking me apart piece by piece. She spun to face her, her eyes fierce. But I'm not going down without a fight. Marjorie nodded, her expression hardening. We'll make sure he pays for this. Doris's phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled for it, her fingers still trembling. The screen lit up with an email from Raphael, property listing. Ethan has claimed power of attorney on the house. He's already listed it for sale. Doris's heart sank. She'd been afraid of this. She had reversed his power of attorney last year. She had the documents to prove it. Yet there it was, in black and white. Ethan had somehow managed to manipulate his way into claiming ownership of the house. Raphael sent this, Doris said, her voice tight with fury. He's already moving ahead with the sale. Marjorie's eyes widened. But you revoked his power of attorney last year. I know, Doris's jaw clenched. But he's got his hands on it now. He's moving faster than we can keep up. Then we'll stop him, Marjorie said firmly. We'll make sure of it. Doris took one last look at the empty house, the walls that had once witnessed her happiness and pain, now bare and cold. She couldn't bring herself to leave yet. But the fire within her had reignited. She wasn't going to let Ethan destroy everything she had. Not without a fight. And she would win. The rumors began to swirl before Doris even realized what was happening. It wasn't the first time she'd felt whispers behind her back, but this was different. It was malicious. Every corner she turned, it felt like eyes were on her, calculating, judging. It was a Sunday morning when the first one hit. She had just walked into the small church, a place she had attended for years, a place that had once felt like home, like sanctuary. The familiar faces of her neighbors greeted her, but something in their eyes wasn't the same. They weren't warm, not like they used to be. Instead, there was something colder, something quieter. Doris couldn't put her finger on it, but the moment she stepped into the pew, she felt it. Then, her daughter, Chelsea, stood up in the middle of the service, her voice carrying through the room as she spoke with unsettling calmness. I think we all know why my mother isn't here today, Chelsea said, her gaze drifting toward Doris with a pointed, almost pitying look. She's chosen assisted living. She's just not stable enough to care for herself anymore. It's heartbreaking, really. Doris's heart dropped. The words hung in the air, a cruel echo that reverberated through every corner of the church. She wanted to stand up, to scream, to say that she wasn't weak, that she hadn't chosen anything, that this wasn't true, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she sat there, still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Chelsea's words continued to sting, but it wasn't just the lie that cut through Doris. It was the way Chelsea had painted her as someone who was frail, someone to be pitied, someone whose decisions were no longer hers to make. And the worst part was, no one questioned it. No one stood up to defend her. No one asked for the truth. Doris stayed silent. She let the whispers wash over her like a storm that couldn't be stopped. It was as if the world around her had turned against her, letting her fall into the shadows without a single hand to lift her back up. Her neighbors looked away when she caught their eyes. They avoided her in the grocery store, at the post office, at church. The rumors had taken root, and there was no way to stop them. But not everyone stayed silent. Marjorie, who had stood by Doris through everything, was the first to take action. She was done letting Ethan, or anyone else, dictate the narrative of Doris's life. The two of them sat together in Doris's now silent home, the air thick with frustration. We need to tell them the truth, Marjorie said firmly, her eyes sharp. People will listen if we show them. We have to show them everything. Doris's heart ached. She didn't want to expose the raw truth. She didn't want to drag it all out in front of the same people who had turned away from her. But the anger and humiliation were bubbling up inside her, and she realized Marjorie was right. Silence wouldn't stop Ethan. It wouldn't stop the lies from spreading. Raphael was already working on his end. The day after Chelsea's accusation, he had sent over a thick envelope, filled with legal documents and clear evidence. Doris had revoked Ethan's power of attorney months ago. Raphael had the official paperwork, the notarized signatures, everything needed to prove that Ethan had no claim on Doris's life or assets. The truth was on paper. Now, they needed to make it known. "We'll use this," Raphael said, his voice steady. "I'll file a petition. We'll expose everything." But there was more. Alan had come through too. He had reviewed the footage from the storage facility. The cameras had been running for weeks, and what they showed was undeniable. Ethan had been there multiple times. Entering the storage unit, Doris had no idea he was renting in her name. Alan had captured it all, the moments when Ethan had slipped in and out, acting like he had every right to be there. "This is it," Alan said, handing Doris the USB drive with the footage. "He's been lying. This will prove it." Doris looked at the small drive in her hand, the weight of it feeling heavier than she ever imagined. This was the smoking gun. This was everything. She stood up, her legs stiff but determined, and walked to the window. The house outside looked the same, but it no longer felt like home. Not after everything that had been stolen from her. She clenched the USB drive in her fist. "I'll make sure they hear the truth," Doris said quietly. Marjorie nodded, her gaze steady and full of resolve. "We'll make them listen. No more lies." The silence that followed was thick with something else too. Something stronger than anger. It was the kind of quiet you feel before the storm hits. Doris could feel it, deep in her chest. Something was about to break. And this time, she wasn't going to be the one broken. But just as Doris turned to face Marjorie, her phone buzzed again. It was another notification, another bank alert. She hesitated before looking at it. "Bank alert. Ethan has made another withdrawal. $2,000. Location unknown." Doris's breath hitched. It was happening again. She knew the pattern now. He was taking whatever he could while she sat here, building her case, gathering the evidence. And yet, with every stolen cent, it felt like he was winning, but not for long. Doris squeezed the USB drive in her hand. There was no going back now. The phone rang again, shattering the stillness of Doris's quiet house. She hadn't heard from Ethan in weeks, but the sound of his name on the caller ID still caused a reflexive knot in her stomach. She didn't answer. She wasn't ready for more of his lies, not yet. Not after what had already been taken from her. But the notifications kept coming. Her bank account drained bit by bit. A slow, steady erosion of her life savings. Then came the legal papers. Doris had spent the last few days immersed in a haze of paperwork. Raphael's petitions, Alan's reports, Marjorie's relentless rallying. But nothing prepared her for the latest. Ethan was filing for guardianship. He claimed Doris was mentally unfit to make decisions for herself after her stroke. The papers were slick with manipulation, laced with half-truths. He wasn't just trying to take her money anymore. Now he was trying to take her autonomy. He was painting her as a woman lost to her own mind, incapable of managing even the simplest of tasks. Doris sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she read the affidavit Chelsea had sworn. Her own daughter, the one who had once cried in her arms, now a part of the effort to dismantle everything Doris had built. Chelsea had painted her as confused, a woman who couldn't even remember basic details, who couldn't make decisions without constant guidance. The words felt like acid on her skin, burning her from the inside out. Her daughter. Doris closed her eyes and let out a sharp breath, trying to steady herself. No, she would not let them win. She had been silent for too long. Marjorie had been relentless since the first day she'd heard about Ethan's moves. She was the one who kept telling Doris to hold firm, to fight back. "Don't let him make you feel small, Doris. Don't let him write your story," Marjorie had said. And Doris had held those words close. But it was Raphael who had made the first real move, demanding an independent evaluation. The words were a lifeline, an opportunity to prove once and for all that Doris was still sharp, still capable, despite what Ethan and Chelsea were trying to claim. 2 days later, Doris found herself sitting in a sterile examination room, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Across from her, a psychiatrist flipped through his notes, glancing up at her occasionally, his pen tapping against the table. "You've been through quite a bit, Mrs. Carver," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "But we're just going to have a conversation, a few questions, and we'll go from there. Is that all right?" Doris nodded, her hands steady now. This was her moment to show them all. She answered each question with precision. Her memories, her thoughts, her awareness of the world around her, there was nothing foggy about it. She was still Doris Carver, a woman who had lived through pain and triumph, and who would not let anyone, least of all her own flesh and blood, take away her dignity. The doctor scribbled down his final notes, nodded once, and stood. "You've passed with full marks, Mrs. Carver. Your mental faculties are sharp. There's no question about that." The words were like a balm on a wound she hadn't even realized was bleeding. She felt a surge of vindication flood through her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this battle was far from over. Ethan wouldn't give up that easily. As the days passed, Doris felt the tension mounting. She knew Ethan would fight harder now, his grip slipping. There was no way he'd surrender without a fight. But the truth was on her side, and as long as she had that, she could stand tall. The court date arrived, and Doris found herself standing before Judge Foster, a man known for his no-nonsense approach. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of her fight. Doris's hands were steady, but her pulse raced. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her to falter. She didn't. The moment she walked into that courtroom, she felt the shift. Judge Foster's eyes met hers, and something in his gaze made her feel seen, not for the frail woman they were trying to paint her as, but for who she truly was, a woman who had been pushed to the edge and refused to be broken. As the proceedings began, Ethan's lawyer went first, painting Doris as a woman incapable of managing her own life. They dragged out her stroke, twisted her weaknesses, and made her seem like a stranger in her own body. But then it was her turn. Raphael stood beside her, and Alan, too, had made his presence known, his evidence undeniable. One by one, they presented the truth, the documentation, the evaluation, the footage of Ethan's secretive behavior. The truth they had painstakingly gathered was laid out, stark and unyielding. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Foster examined the evidence. Doris could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the tension crackling in the air. Finally, the judge spoke. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour to deliberate," Judge Foster said, his voice calm but firm. Doris's chest tightened. This was it. The storm was here. As she turned to leave, she whispered to Marjorie, her voice barely audible. "Perfect." Marjorie's eyes met hers, a small but knowing smile creeping across her face. They had fought for the truth, and now it was time to see if the truth would be enough. Doris held her breath, but deep down she knew one thing: Ethan's time was running out. And this time, it was his turn to be caught in the storm. The phone call came late, just as Doris was settling into the quiet of the evening. Raphael's voice crackled on the other end, a note of urgency cutting through the usual calm. "Doris," he began, his tone low but precise, "we've got a problem." A big one. Doris's stomach clenched. What now? The walls of her life had been shaking for weeks. Ethan's lies, Chelsea's betrayal, the courtroom battle that felt like a battle for her very soul. She had fought back, stood her ground, but each new revelation felt like another punch. "What happened?" she asked, bracing herself. "I've been reviewing the credit card statements, looking for anything unusual, and I found something, several charges, all tied to a single card. A card you didn't issue. The payments, they're being made to a facility, and not just any facility, the one your daughter's been using for billing. It's tied to her account." Doris's mind spun. The pieces clicked together in a sickening way. Chelsea, her own daughter, was using Doris's name for payments, taking advantage of her just like Ethan had. She had seen the signs, but now the truth was crystallizing before her eyes. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. "I'm sending you the details now," Raphael continued, his voice tight with frustration. "I'll also need to involve the authorities. This is fraud, Doris. We've got enough here to file a police report." Doris sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of it settling heavily on her shoulders. She had been shaken by the accusations in the courtroom, her strength tested every day. But this was different. This wasn't just about power of attorney or guardianship. It was about her life being picked apart, every last piece stolen. Her own flesh and blood had buried her under a mound of lies, of debts, of manipulation. She blinked hard, pushing down the rise of panic. She couldn't afford to break now, not when she was so close. "I'll do whatever needs to be done," Doris said, her voice more steady than she felt. "Let's get this out in the open." By morning, the weight of the situation had only deepened. Alan called her with more news. This time, the discovery was even more damning. He had gone through the records of the storage facility, where Ethan had been seen entering and leaving with increasing frequency. Chelsea, too, had used the address. Her name was on invoices for services Doris had never ordered. Alan's voice was tight, almost angry as he relayed the details. "We've got them cornered, Doris," Alan said, his words cutting through the silence. "I've got proof of fraud, and I'm pretty sure they've been working together on this." Doris gripped the phone, her knuckles white. How far had this gone? "Raphael's already in motion. We need to get the police involved, officially." Alan paused. "This isn't just a betrayal anymore. This is organized theft." A sharp breath filled Doris's lungs. The quiet of her home had never felt so oppressive, so suffocating. She walked over to the window, her gaze drifting outside, watching the sun dip low on the horizon. It should have been peaceful, calming, but it felt like the last remnants of calm before a storm. She didn't have much time before things would explode. She could feel it. That night, Doris filed the police report. She signed her name with a steady hand, though inside, her heart raced. Her daughter had used her name, her account, her very identity for her own gain. The enormity of it felt almost surreal. She could barely comprehend the depths of the deception. But this time, Doris wasn't backing down. Marjorie came by later, bringing with her not just comfort, but a fire that Doris was starting to match. The weight of everything, the public humiliation, the endless legal back and forth, it had shaken Doris, yes, but she was learning to see the pieces fall into place. She could almost taste the vengeance now. "They buried you in debt, Doris," Marjorie said softly, her hand resting on Doris's shoulder. "But you'll bury them in court. Don't let them think they can walk away unscathed." Doris looked at Marjorie, seeing the fire in her eyes, the unwavering belief in their fight. For the first time in weeks, Doris felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just going to win this fight. She was going to obliterate the lies, expose the cruelty. They thought they had trapped her, thought they could break her, but Doris wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. By the time the story started to leak, through whispers and murmurs in the community, Doris felt the tide begin to turn. People who had once avoided her at the grocery store, at church, were now watching her closely, murmuring in the shadows. The whispers weren't just about her anymore. They were about Ethan and Chelsea too. About their manipulation. The community, once so quick to cast her aside, was starting to ask questions. And that was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur. The courtroom would reconvene soon, and Doris knew the truth would finally come crashing down. Her enemies thought they had the upper hand, but soon they would be exposed. They would have nowhere to hide. As Doris sat in her kitchen later that night, reading through the documents once more, she heard a knock at the door. Her breath caught, unsure who it could be. She opened it to find a local reporter standing on her porch, a camera hanging from his neck. "We've been following the developments with your case," the reporter said, his voice eager. "Would you be willing to make a statement?" Doris stood still for a moment, the weight of the question hanging in the air. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say, but one thing was certain. The tide was turning. The world was starting to see the truth. She looked at the reporter, the fire inside her igniting once more. "Sure," Doris said. her voice as sharp as the steel rising in her chest. "I've got a story to tell." The courtroom was quieter than Doris expected, the air heavy with anticipation. The faint hum of murmurs rippled through the room, the sound of people shifting in their seats as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Ethan sat at the front, a smug smile on his face, a man confident that today would be his victory. Beside him, Chelsea's eyes darted nervously from one person to the next, her fingers clutching the hem of her jacket in a tight, almost unconscious grip. She still hadn't quite seemed to fully realize the magnitude of the battle they were fighting. Doris, on the other hand, was fully awake to the fight. Every step she took toward the witness stand felt like an echo, a drumbeat of defiance in the midst of a storm. With her cane in hand, she walked in slowly but with absolute determination. The soft tap of the cane on the marble floor punctuated each stride, the rhythm steady, unyielding. She might have aged, she might have been weakened by her stroke, but she was still Doris Carver. She was still there. She could feel the eyes of the room on her as she entered, but they no longer made her shrink. The weight of their gazes wasn't a burden, it was fuel. Doris held her head high, her shoulders squared, the small tremble of her hands barely noticeable as she took her seat. She was not frail, she was a force. Ethan's eyes flicked to her, his smile slipping for a moment as he saw the strength in her presence. Chelsea, too, seemed uneasy, glancing down at her lap. Doris held their gaze, a quiet but piercing challenge in her eyes. Judge Foster entered then, his presence commanding instant silence. He took his seat at the bench, and the proceedings began. His stern expression showed no trace of bias, only the professionalism of a man who had seen it all before. His eyes flicked between the lawyers, then to Doris, as though sizing up the battlefield. He was sharp, and Doris could feel that sharpness, like the edge of a blade. "Let us proceed," Judge Foster said, his voice deep and steady. Raphael rose first. He was prepared. The air was thick with a tension that could only come before a storm. "Your Honor, we are here today to prove that these allegations against Mrs. Ray Carver are not just unfounded, but are the result of a deliberate attempt to defraud and manipulate her," Raphael began, his voice firm, cutting through the air like a knife. "To that end, I would like to introduce Exhibit A." He held up a document, crisp and clean, the paper practically glowing in the courtroom's fluorescent light. "This is a forged rental agreement," Raphael continued, his voice growing more insistent. "Signed by Mrs. Carver, though she was unconscious in a hospital bed at the time. It was used by Ethan Carver to rent a storage unit without her knowledge. We have proof, Your Honor, that he took advantage of her condition to carry out his scheme." Raphael passed the document to the clerk, who filed it before the judge. Doris watched as the judge skimmed through it, his brow furrowing slightly in concentration. Raphael moved quickly, clearly anticipating every step. Next, Alan took the stand. His presence was a calm anchor in the sea of chaos. He adjusted his glasses and turned to face the room, his voice steady but commanding. "I have reviewed the footage from the storage facility," Alan said, "and I can confirm that Ethan Carver was accessing that unit repeatedly before Mrs. Carver was even hospitalized. These visits were unauthorized. There was no reason for him to be there, other than to further his own interests at the expense of Mrs. Carver." The courtroom held its breath as Alan's words sank in. Doris could feel her pulse quicken, but she refused to let her emotions overtake her. She was watching the pieces of her life, her truth, unfold before her. It was more than just a legal battle. It was the unmasking of every lie, every twist in the story. Ethan's lawyer shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. We're talking about an event that happened months ago, and no direct evidence has been presented." Judge Foster's eyes flicked to the defense attorney, then back to Alan. "Sustained. Let's stick to the facts, please." Doris felt a chill pass over her as she watched Ethan's face tighten with frustration. His confident facade was beginning to crack, his cocky smirk replaced with a twitching jaw. But he wasn't backing down. Not yet. Chelsea's voice broke the tension as she whispered something to her lawyer, too low for Doris to hear. But Doris didn't need to hear. She could see it all in the way Chelsea refused to look at her, the way her fingers gripped her jacket tighter with each passing moment. As the proceedings continued, Doris noticed that Ethan's lawyers seemed to be growing more desperate, latching onto anything that might distract the court. But the damage was done. The fraud was clear. The lies were unraveling, and through it all, Judge Foster remained silent, his face unreadable. He hadn't seemed particularly moved by anything Ethan had said. The lawyers' excuses fell flat, their logic thin. No one was buying the act anymore. The clock ticked on, the tension building with each passing second. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, but the final nail hadn't been struck yet. Doris held her breath, eyes locked on the judge as he made his notes. She knew the verdict was coming soon, but whether it was in her favor or not, she couldn't quite tell. "Mr. Carver," Judge Foster finally spoke, his voice like thunder in the quiet room. "Your actions are under scrutiny, and I'm afraid that this court will not look kindly on the attempts to manipulate Mrs. Carver's financial and personal autonomy." The sentence hung in the air, but just before the judge could continue, Doris's heart skipped. She could see the truth was on the brink of being fully revealed, but she wasn't done yet. The real battle hadn't begun. This was only the opening salvo. The atmosphere in the courtroom had thickened to an almost unbearable silence as Ethan's lawyer slid a document across the table. Doris's eyes narrowed as she watched it, knowing exactly what it was before the lawyer even spoke. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice smug, "I'd like to present a power of attorney signed by Mrs. Carver herself. This grants Mr. Carver the legal authority to make decisions on her behalf. Clearly, he had the right to act as her guardian, to manage her finances, and to handle all related affairs." Ethan's eyes gleamed with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing you've planted the perfect trap. He had been waiting for this moment, as if he'd been playing the long game, ensuring his victory was just a formality. Doris's stomach twisted as the document was handed to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of what was happening settling on her shoulders. Raphael, however, was already on his feet, the motion as smooth and calculated as ever. He reached into his briefcase and produced another document, this one with the familiar official seal that had been pressed into so many of Doris's papers in recent weeks. "Your Honor," Raphael said, his voice steady, "I must counter this with the revocation of that very power of attorney." He unfolded the document slowly, letting its weight settle in the room like a challenge. This was signed and notarized months ago, long before Mr. Carver's attempts to manipulate Mrs. Carver's affairs. The power of attorney was revoked, making any actions taken by him under that authority invalid. The murmurs in the gallery began, the civil observers leaning forward, their collective gaze moving between the two documents. Doris felt a flutter of something, vindication perhaps, but she kept her expression steady. This was just another piece of the puzzle, a piece that had been waiting to be placed. Judge Foster took the documents, his face unreadable as he examined both of them. Doris watched him closely, his eyes scanning the text with meticulous care. Ethan shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable now, his confident air cracking, little by little. The judge's pen hovered over the papers as he glanced up at Ethan, who was still holding himself with a kind of quiet desperation. It wasn't the same smugness he had worn before. Now he was fighting against the walls closing in around him. "Mr. Carver," Judge Foster said, his voice calm but piercing, "you claim authority over Mrs. Senator Carver's affairs, yet you have no legal standing to do so. This document," he waved the revocation in the air, "clearly nullifies that claim." Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. The usual words, the rehearsed excuses, seemed to have evaporated into the air. He shifted again, his gaze flickering between the judge and the courtroom, looking for an escape that wasn't there. I didn't know about this," Ethan stammered, his voice shaking, the first cracks of fear breaking through his composed facade. This document, it's fake. It can't be real." There was a collective intake of breath from the gallery, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the room. Ethan's voice faltered, the confidence evaporating as his words tangled together in an incoherent mess. Chelsea, who had been sitting silent for most of the proceedings, suddenly spoke up, her voice sharp with what was likely panic. "It's not fake," she interjected, her eyes wide, too quick, too defensive. She must have signed it in a moment of confusion, or... Her voice trailed off, and Doris caught the subtle slip. She had said it. the exact thing they had been trying to avoid. Confusion. A word that implied a lack of clarity, a lack of capacity, a word that Ethan had been using for months to justify his actions. But it was Chelsea's voice that had betrayed them. "Did you say confusion?" Raphael asked, his voice rising slightly, every word a precise cut. "So you're suggesting that Mrs. Carver wasn't in her right mind when she revoked the power of attorney?" Chelsea's face turned pale, her eyes darting between the judge and the gallery. She had made a mistake, one that had laid bare the entire facade they had been trying to maintain. Judge Foster's sharp eyes flicked to the defense table, his gaze like an eagle eyeing its prey. "Ms. Carver," he said, his voice cutting through the room, "it seems your words just now have contradicted the very case you're trying to make." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick in the air. Doris could feel the weight of the moment, the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. The lies that had woven through her family's life for months, perhaps years, were unraveling before her eyes. She turned her gaze to Ethan, who had gone rigid beside Chelsea. His facade was shattered now, his attempt to control the narrative collapsing under the weight of his own words. Doris couldn't suppress the faintest smile that curled at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a smile of victory, at least, not yet, but it was a quiet acknowledgement. They had underestimated her. They thought she was broken, but here she was, stronger than ever. And with that, the storm was nearing its peak. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and Doris could hear the stirrings of disbelief, the whispers of realization. This wasn't just a courtroom battle anymore. It was a reckoning. Judge Foster's voice broke through the noise. "I believe we've heard enough for today," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We will reconvene after a brief recess." As the gavel came down, Doris held her breath, but her heart beat with a renewed strength. The battle was far from over, but it was clear now. The walls they'd built to imprison her were starting to crack. And the truth? It was coming for them all. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the recess. Doris sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, heart pounding in her chest. The air in the courtroom had thickened again, the tension palpable, but she could feel the shift. This moment was hers. Ethan and Chelsea were backing themselves into a corner. They were no longer the aggressors. They were scrambling to hold on to a crumbling facade. Raphael stood, his calm demeanor belying the storm of evidence he was about to unleash. Doris knew this next move would be critical. As he rose to speak, her pulse quickened, anticipation building. "Your Honor," Raphael began, his voice steady, but there was a new edge to it. "I have uncovered further discrepancies in the Carver family's financial dealings. Specifically, I've come across evidence of a second mortgage on Mrs. Carver's home, one that she was unaware of." There was a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Doris's stomach dropped. She had trusted Ethan, had believed he was looking out for her, making sure everything was handled when her health faltered. But this was another betrayal, another thread of deception woven deep into the fabric of her life. How had they managed to pull this off? The document Raphael held was unmistakable. The second mortgage, taken out in Doris's name, showed up with a substantial loan amount, one that clearly exceeded the value of the home. Ethan's signature was there, bold and confident, but Doris's was nowhere to be found. She had never signed this loan. She never would have. Judge Foster's expression darkened as he scanned the document. His pen hovered above his legal pad. His jaw clenched. He looked up at Ethan, his voice low and controlled, but it had the bite of an angry storm just waiting to break. "Mr. Carver," Judge Foster said, his gaze sharp as a knife, "you have committed fraud. You have taken advantage of Mrs. Carver in ways I cannot even begin to fathom. This is an egregious violation of the law." Ethan, already on shaky ground, sputtered, his voice cracking as he tried to salvage his position. This is all Chelsea's fault. She knew about the second mortgage. His words trailed off as he caught the look in Chelsea's eyes. For the first time, she wasn't defending him. She wasn't fighting back, trying to cover up the lies. Instead, Chelsea sat there, a cold look in her eyes, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Stop lying," Chelsea said, her voice sharp, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. She stood up slowly, her eyes locking on her father. "We did it for us, for the future. We needed the money and you weren't going to give it to us." Her voice faltered for a moment, but her eyes never wavered from Ethan's. "You left us no choice." The gallery was silent, all eyes on Chelsea as the full weight of her words hung in the air. We did it for us. She had just implicated herself in the fraud, making it clear that this wasn't a mistake, wasn't an accident. They had been in this together, had planned it, and now the truth was unraveling before them all. Doris felt a surge of something, anger, yes, but also relief. The truth was out. Ethan's game, the lies, the manipulation, all of it was coming apart at the seams, and now Chelsea, her own daughter, had just sealed their fate. Judge Foster's face darkened, the anger in his eyes barely contained. He didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence stretch out, thick with the weight of Chelsea's confession. Finally, his voice broke through the stillness. "Enough." His tone was firm, unyielding. "I'm ordering an emergency freeze of all assets associated with the Carver estate. We will begin an immediate investigation into this mortgage and the fraudulent activities surrounding it. There will be no further movement of funds until this court has concluded its inquiry." The gavel slammed down once more, the sound reverberating through the room like a final sentence. Doris's mind raced. The fraud, the betrayal, the complicity of her own daughter. It was all too much. And yet, it was somehow a relief. The truth was coming, piece by piece, and they couldn't stop it. But as the courtroom slowly began to empty, the media cameras that had been waiting for their moment surged forward, their lenses focused on Doris. The scandal was already breaking. Reporters shoved microphones toward her, asking questions, trying to capture the moment in sound bites. "Mrs. Carver," one reporter called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "How does it feel to have your family exposed like this? What will you do next?" Doris felt the weight of the question pressing on her. But it was nothing compared to the weight of everything she had endured. She had been torn apart, manipulated, deceived, but she was standing. She was still here. The story was hers now. With a deep breath, Doris straightened, facing the cameras with a calm she hadn't known she was capable of. "I'll see them in court," she said simply, her voice steady, the words more powerful than anything she could have imagined just weeks ago. And as the media swarmed and the world began to hear her story, Doris knew this was far from over. But the tide had turned. And soon, Ethan and Chelsea would have nowhere left to run. Section 11. Family on Trial. The days since the emergency freeze on the Carver estate had dragged on, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The courtroom was only one battlefield in a war Doris was still fighting, and with every passing day, the criminal investigation into Ethan and Chelsea's fraudulent activities grew more intense. Doris could feel the shift in the air, a change that would eventually fracture the family beyond repair. They thought they had won, but the truth was coming, slow, methodical, and unstoppable. Ethan was unraveling. Doris knew that with every call she received from him, his desperation was becoming more palpable. She'd let the phone ring a few times before answering it that morning. "I didn't do it," Ethan's voice had come through the line, shaky, with a false note of confidence. "I didn't mean for this to go this far, Doris. But we can still fix it. We'll make a deal. Please, just listen to me." The words made Doris's stomach churn. Fix it? We'll make a deal? As if there was still a way to undo the damage they had done. The sheer audacity of it took her breath away. Ethan had spent months manipulating, stealing, lying, and now he wanted a plea deal. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so tragic. She hadn't bothered to respond. There was no fixing what he had broken. On the other side of the family, Chelsea's arrogance had only grown since the court hearing. Doris could hear it in the way Chelsea spoke, as if the world still revolved around her, as if she could outmaneuver the truth with her sharp tongue. Doris had overheard a conversation Chelsea had had with one of Ethan's lawyers the day before. "We'll win this," Chelsea had said, her voice dripping with certainty. "The law's on our side. They won't be able to touch us. Trust me, this'll blow over." But Doris wasn't fooled. She could see the cracks beneath Chelsea's bravado. the underlying panic in her voice that she refused to acknowledge. Chelsea had built this house of lies with Ethan, brick by brick, and now the foundation was crumbling beneath their feet. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about damage control, about saving whatever pieces of themselves they could. The phone call had left Doris feeling hollow, but as she sat in her living room that evening, with the steady rhythm of the clock ticking in the background, she found her resolve hardening. She was no longer the woman they thought they could control. She was not going to let them drag her down with them. She had the truth on her side. "Let them destroy each other," Marjorie had said when they last spoke, her voice unwavering. "They've dug this hole for themselves. And once the prosecutors subpoena the bank records, they won't have anywhere left to run. They'll bury themselves with their own lies." Marjorie's words echoed in Doris's mind. It was the quiet truth she needed to hear. The law was moving in their direction, and it wasn't just about the second mortgage anymore. This was about everything Ethan and Chelsea had hidden. Every fraudulent transaction, every stolen penny, all of it being laid bare for the world to see. Doris's phone buzzed once more, dragging her from her thoughts. Raphael's name appeared on the screen. She answered quickly, her pulse quickening with anticipation. "Doris, they're digging in now," Raphael's voice crackled through the line. "We've got them cornered. The prosecutors are subpoenaing their bank records as we speak. There's a trail of money moving around, and it's clear Ethan's been playing the long game. This goes way beyond just the second mortgage." Doris took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of dread and relief. The truth was coming. It was getting closer with every step. And soon, the walls Ethan and Chelsea had built would come crashing down around them. "They won't get away with this," she said quietly but firmly. Raphael was silent for a moment. "No, they won't. And when they see the full picture, they won't have anywhere to hide." The prosecutors were already starting to piece everything together, tracing fraudulent loans, hidden assets, and unauthorized transactions through the financial records. Doris wasn't surprised, not anymore. Ethan and Chelsea had thought they could outsmart everyone, but they were forgetting one thing. They weren't as clever as they thought. And they certainly weren't smarter than the law. A knock at the door startled Doris from her thoughts, the sound sharp in the stillness of the room. She rose slowly, feeling a flutter of unease. When she opened the door, she wasn't expecting what stood before her. It was the reporter from last week, his presence more serious this time, no cameras in hand, but a folder under his arm. "Mrs. Carver," he began, his voice hesitant. "I think you need to see this." Doris's stomach dropped as he handed her the folder. She looked down at the contents, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the papers inside. It was a full set of the bank records, transactions she hadn't seen yet, evidence of the money laundering, and, more shockingly, a new discovery. Ethan and Chelsea had been funneling funds through accounts she didn't even know existed. Her heart raced. This was it, the final piece. With shaking hands, Doris turned to the reporter. "Where did you get this?" He glanced around nervously, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just say the walls are closing in on them. And when the truth comes out, it won't be pretty." The world had just shifted again, and this time, Ethan and Chelsea weren't the ones pulling the strings. This was Doris's moment. It was her time to finally take control. And she would. She would see this through to the end. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the day's session began, the air thick with the promise of something more. Doris sat quietly at the witness stand, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though her pulse was racing beneath the calm exterior, she had seen the papers, the records, the proof that Ethan and Chelsea had been playing a game of deception and greed. But now it was her turn to face them. The prosecutor, Diego, stood at the front of the room, his voice sharp and commanding as he addressed the jury. He had the confidence of a man who knew the truth was on his side, and today he would show it. He was about to expose the full scope of the fraud that had wrecked Doris's life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Diego began, his tone steady, "what we are dealing with here is not a series of unfortunate mistakes, but a deliberate and calculated attempt to defraud Mrs. Carver. These two individuals, Ethan and Chelsea Carver, used every trick in the book to manipulate and steal from the very woman who trusted them the most." Doris clenched her fists under the table. She wasn't surprised anymore by the depth of their betrayal, but it still stung. It still felt like a knife to the gut every time their actions were laid bare. Diego clicked a button on his remote, and the large screen behind him flickered to life. A series of images appeared: bank records, fraudulent credit card charges, and a trail of mortgages that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The first of many fraudulent acts, Diego continued, is a series of unauthorized credit card charges taken under Mrs. Carver's name. These charges were used to funnel money into Ethan Carver's personal accounts. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that should have gone to Mrs. Carver's well-being, but instead was stolen and hidden. Doris could see the faint outlines of the transactions on the screen, her own name stamped across them. Her heart tightened, but she refused to let the emotion overwhelm her. She had come this far. She wasn't going to break now. Diego clicked another button, and the screen shifted to a different set of images, footage from the storage facility. Doris's breath caught in her throat as the video began to play. It showed Ethan unmistakably loading boxes and furniture into a truck, with no care for what he was taking. It was her life, her belongings, reduced to mere items he could sell or hide. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Alan's footage played out in front of them all. Doris could see Ethan, the man who had once been her partner, her family, acting like a thief, his face cold and indifferent to the destruction he was causing. The video ended, and the courtroom seemed to exhale in unison, the weight of the evidence hanging in the air like smoke. Doris turned her gaze back to the stand, where Ethan sat, his eyes fixed on the ground, his hands shaking slightly. He hadn't spoken since the proceedings had started. He had no words left to defend himself, no more lies to tell. It wasn't enough to steal money, Diego's voice rang out. Ethan Carver also took from his mother her sense of security, her dignity. He used her own belongings as collateral for his own schemes, and when that wasn't enough, he forged documents to take even more. The prosecutor paused, allowing the words to settle. Then he turned to Doris, who was seated at the witness stand, ready to speak for herself. The room went quiet. It was her turn, her moment. "Mrs. Carver," Diego asked, his voice softening slightly, "could you tell us in your own words what it was like to discover this betrayal?" Doris took a deep breath. The question was simple, but the answer was everything. She looked over at Ethan, still silent, still broken. But as she spoke, she saw the cracks in his facade deepen, the man he had been crumbling in front of her. "I woke up to betrayal," Doris said, her voice steady but tinged with the quiet heartbreak of all that had been lost. "I trusted my son, my daughter, they were my family, but what I found was nothing but lies and theft. I wasn't just robbed of money, but of my peace, my trust, my sense of safety." The words hung in the air like a declaration. Doris's eyes never left Ethan's as she spoke, watching the subtle shift in his expression. There was nothing left of the confident man who had once made her believe in his good intentions. He was a shell, crumbling before the world. Judge Foster, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, shifted in his seat. Doris saw his gaze flicker toward her, his face momentarily softening. For the first time, it seemed like he was moved, truly moved by her words. But before anything else could happen, a sharp scream shattered the silence. Chelsea, who had been sitting silently in the gallery, suddenly leapt to her feet, her hands shaking with rage. "This is all your fault," she screamed, pointing at Ethan. "You did this. You promised me everything." "I was only trying to survive, and now look what's happened." Her voice cracked with emotion, and she stormed toward the aisle, her eyes wild, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Some stood, others murmured, but no one was prepared for what came next. Ethan sat there, utterly motionless. His face had gone white, his lips tight, his eyes empty. The fire in Chelsea had only made him retreat further into himself. He no longer had the strength to argue, to fight, or even to defend himself. Chelsea's breakdown was violent, uncontrollable, but it wasn't just a meltdown. It was the final unraveling of their facade. Doris watched it all unfold, but there was no satisfaction in her. This wasn't her victory. It was theirs. They had torn themselves apart. and she had done nothing more than stand still, waiting for the truth to expose them. Judge Foster banged his gavel sharply, trying to restore order, but the damage had already been done. The Carvers had begun to destroy themselves, and no amount of pleading or screaming could stop it now. Doris remained calm, her heart steady, knowing this was just the beginning of the end. The truth had set its course, and there was no going back. The courtroom was hushed as the judge's final words echoed through the room. Doris sat still, her hands folded on her lap, her back straight despite the weight of the world that had shifted in the last few months. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now the end was in sight. The gavel had already come down once, but it was nothing compared to the sound it would make when the final verdict was delivered. Judge Foster stood, his expression grim as he glanced down at the papers in front of him. Reviewing the final findings, the room waited in tense silence, each person holding their breath. Ethan and Chelsea sat together at the defense table, their once confident postures now deflated, their faces drawn with the weight of their guilt. Chelsea's eyes were red from the earlier outburst, and Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the floor, as if unable to face what was happening. "Ethan Carver," Judge Foster began, his voice calm but unyielding, "you have pled guilty to a series of fraudulent activities, including the unauthorized use of your mother's financial resources and the manipulation of her assets for personal gain. The court recognizes the remorse you have expressed, and though your actions have caused irreparable harm, your cooperation with the investigation and guilty plea will result in a reduced sentence." Doris's breath caught in her throat. She had wanted more, had hoped for justice that would fully match the crime, but there was little satisfaction in seeing Ethan break. His guilt had already shattered him. The thought of him walking away with a lighter sentence felt like a hollow victory. But she knew the truth had been exposed. That, at least, was something. Judge Foster continued, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "You will be sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility, with eligibility for parole after 2 years. The court hopes that in this time, you will come to understand the depth of your betrayal and the cost of your actions." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Doris remained silent, her gaze unwavering. Ethan's head snapped up at the mention of his sentence, but his eyes were dull, resigned. He didn't look like a man facing a reduced sentence. He looked like a man who had lost everything, and perhaps that was his true punishment. Judge Foster shifted his attention to Chelsea, who had been sitting rigidly beside Ethan, her face tight with anger and something else, fear. "Chelsea Carver," the judge continued, his voice harder, "you stand convicted of full complicity in the fraudulent actions that have nearly destroyed your mother's life. Your attempts to shift the blame and your lack of remorse throughout these proceedings have left this court with no choice but to sentence you to the maximum penalty under the law." Chelsea's lips trembled as she heard the words, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. The smug arrogance she had carried with her through the trial had vanished. She had thought the truth would bend to her will, but now, in the face of it, there was nothing left. "You will serve 10 years in a federal prison without the possibility of parole," Judge Foster declared, his voice final. "May you come to understand the depth of the wrongs you have committed." Chelsea's face crumpled, and she seemed to deflate, as if all the fight had drained from her at once. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, but no one in the room offered sympathy. She had done this to herself. Then, the moment Doris had been waiting for finally arrived. The judge's gaze moved to her, softening ever so slightly. "Mrs. Carver," Judge Foster began, his voice almost gentle, "you have been the victim of a devastating betrayal by those you trusted most. In recognition of your loss, and to help begin the process of recovery, the court awards you full restitution for the damages done, including all funds stolen and misused by your son and daughter. Additionally, ownership of all assets tied to the estate, including the family home, is hereby reinstated to you." Doris's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had been waiting for this moment, the one where she would take back control of her life. The weight of the loss, the money, the betrayal would never leave her, but she was whole again. She had her life back. As the courtroom slowly emptied, media outlets swarmed the space, reporters' microphones thrust forward, eager to capture the story. Headlines blared on every screen, their flashing lights almost blinding. Mother wins against greedy heirs. Doris Carver regains control. Daughter sentenced to prison for fraud. Family betrayal exposed. The words felt distant, almost unreal. Doris didn't care about the headlines, not anymore. She didn't care about revenge or validation. She cared about taking the first step into her future, one she could finally call her own. As she slowly stood, cane in hand, the sound of it tapping against the floor seemed louder than ever. She walked slowly, with a strength she hadn't felt in months. Each tap of the cane was a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had endured. Marjorie was waiting for her at the door, a small but knowing smile on her face. She stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Doris's shoulder. "You did it," Marjorie said, her voice steady and proud. Doris looked at her friend, feeling a swell of emotion she didn't know how to express. She simply nodded, the weight of her journey catching up with her, but she was still standing. She had survived, and no matter what came next, she would continue to rise. The weight of the courtroom's final verdict had lingered for days, but now, in the quiet of her own home, Doris could finally start to breathe again. The gavel's echo had faded, and with it, the long battle for her life and dignity. The reality of it all still felt surreal. Ethan was legally cut off from her, his power of attorney revoked, his ties severed. He was no longer entitled to any of her assets or decisions. Doris had been legally estranged from her son, a devastating truth, but it was necessary for her peace. Ethan's attempts to contact her had stopped after the final sentence, each message more desperate than the last. Doris had blocked every attempt. She had nothing left to say to him. The man she had known, the son she had raised, was a stranger now. His words were hollow to her, and his apologies empty. She had learned the hard way that love and loyalty could be twisted, distorted, until it was nothing but manipulation. Chelsea, too, had been swept into the consequences of her actions. She sat behind bars, facing the full weight of her crimes. The court had seen through her facade. And now she was paying the price. The home, the money, the stolen resources, they were all gone from her grasp, seized by the state as restitution for the damage she had caused. The silence between them was final, too. Doris hadn't shed a tear for Chelsea. She had lost that daughter long ago, buried beneath layers of lies and greed. The woman who stood accused was not the girl who had once leaned on her for comfort. Doris sat at her kitchen table, the bank records spread before her like a map to a new life. The restitution funds had arrived, filling the hole that had once seemed impossible to repair. It wasn't enough to undo the years of betrayal, but it was something. It was a foundation on which to rebuild. For the first time in months, the number on the bottom of the balance sheet didn't feel like a reminder of her losses. Instead, it felt like a lifeline, a tangible step toward reclaiming control. As she closed the folder, Doris felt a lightness she hadn't known since the whole nightmare began. Her life was hers again, her decisions hers to make. She had been stripped of everything once, but now she was standing tall. Slowly, with deliberate steps, she moved to the window. Outside, the world was alive. The trees were heavy with green, the sun was beginning to set, and there was a sense of calm in the air. It felt like the world was finally exhaling alongside her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Marjorie standing on the porch, a broad smile lighting up her face. In her hands, she held a small bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought we could toast," Marjorie said with a wink, stepping past Doris into the kitchen. "A little celebration, just the 2 of us." Doris couldn't help but smile as she followed her friend to the table. The weight of the past weeks had been so heavy. But now there was only this moment of quiet victory, a quiet reclamation of her life. As Marjorie poured the wine, Doris looked out the window, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The neighborhood, once filled with whispers and side glances, was beginning to change. Neighbors who had avoided her, who had cast their judgments without understanding, were now offering smiles, nods of respect. She had weathered the storm, and it seemed the tide was finally turning. They weren't looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with something else, respect. "You did it, Doris," Marjorie said, her voice soft. "You fought for yourself, and you won." Doris lifted her glass, the wine catching the last rays of sunlight, and felt the warmth of it wash over her. She had done it. She had survived the storm, and she would rebuild. With a deep breath, she took a sip. For the first time in what felt like forever, Doris felt peace settling into her bones. The storm had passed. The house that had once felt like a prison now felt like a home again. And though there was still a long road ahead, she was no longer alone. The soft hum of the evening settled over Doris as she sat back in the rocking chair of her new Clearwater bungalow, a comfortable distance from the past. The house was small, simple, but it felt like a sanctuary. She could already hear the difference in the quiet. No more the murmur of gossiping neighbors or the quiet dread that used to haunt her every step. Now it was the sound of the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket, the distant echo of laughter. The last few months had been a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and the slow crawl of her life being rebuilt. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, everything felt still, solid, finally hers. Marjorie sat beside her, a glass of iced tea in her hand, her smile content. Full of the kind of peace Doris hadn't known for so long. Carla, who had been a quiet force in Doris's life, laughed beside them, the soft sound of it filling the space between the three women. It was the kind of evening Doris had once dreamed of, surrounded by friends, free from the weight of betrayal, and basking in the golden glow of the setting sun. Doris let out a long breath, her hand resting on the arm of the chair. The cane she had used in the past months rested beside her, untouched for the evening, but it was a symbol nonetheless, a symbol of what she had overcome. A reminder of how far she'd come. "I never thought I'd get here," Doris murmured, her voice quieter than before. She didn't speak to anyone in particular. It was more of a thought out loud, something she hadn't said even to herself until now. "They left me in cold cement. I rose stronger." The weight of those words settled softly in the air. She had been buried by lies and greed, forced into silence, her life turned upside down by those she had trusted most. But in the end, they had miscalculated. They had underestimated the strength she had left, the strength she'd always had. Marjorie's voice broke through the silence, gentle but firm, a knowing smile in her tone. "You fought for yourself, Doris. No one else could have done it but you." Carla nodded, her eyes bright in the fading light. "And look at you now. This is your home, your life." Doris didn't respond immediately. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sunset wash over her, the cool breeze brushing her skin. The house, her home, was quiet now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once ruled her life. Yet it was filled with something far more important: peace. The porch light flickered on in the distance, casting a soft, welcoming glow across the yard. Doris looked at it, its light cutting through the growing darkness, illuminating the path ahead. They had tried to bury me, she thought, watching the glow of the light slowly fill the space around her. They stored me away, thinking I'd be forgotten. Her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of the chair. I kept my story and my home. She wasn't broken anymore. She wasn't a victim of their lies or their manipulation. She was a woman who had reclaimed herself. Her dignity, her story, her life, everything had been ripped away from her once, but no longer. The sound of laughter rang out once more, this time with an ease that felt earned. Doris smiled, her heart full of something she had almost forgotten existed: joy. It was simple, fleeting perhaps, but it was hers. The cane beside her chair remained untouched, a relic, a symbol, but it no longer defined her. She did. The porch light flickered again, casting a warm glow into the growing darkness. It was the last thing Doris saw before the world faded to evening, but it was enough. She could face whatever came next with strength, her strength, and no matter what happened this time, she would stand tall.